Thanks for having me here today. My name is Kurt Steinke. Some of you probably have seen me in the past. So I'm the fertility specialist at Michigan State. So I focus in corn, soybean, winter wheat, soft red and white, sugar beet, potato, and dry bean systems. So I'm not a bored person most of the year. We're planting for 3 months, we're harvesting for 3 or 4 months, and in between we're probably side dressing and doing who knows what. So quite a variety of crops, and it's always interesting to see what you can learn from some of these other cropping systems and what you can apply to what we're going to talk about today a little bit on corn management. Any Spartans in the room? All right, go green. There we go. But I know where I'm at, so I'm smart enough to realize that. Finally, some great weather. Although I think today we might actually have better weather than you all down here. We actually had some sun for the first time in quite some time. But I'm a big outdoorsman. Love the cold. Love the snow. Ice fishing, skiing, etc. But it gives you a lot of time to think. Think about what went right this last growing season, perhaps what went wrong, what you could do better, what we can adjust, maybe try to think what actually happened and why it happened. So, and I've been preaching most of this winter, the current reality is most of us in this room, from the grower perspective, are probably not all that happy, not all that rosy. We know prices are starting to climb, if not already. We know commodity prices are somewhat stagnant, not as high as we would like. And I've seen this across the board. We're talking about corn today, but I talked to some dry bean growers and sugar beet growers the last couple of weeks. Nobody is happy with where things are at. Obviously, some of that can change with the stroke of a pen. We'll see what happens moving forward. But, one thing we've been talking about all winter across cropping systems is yield versus profitability. And from the grower perspective, you have to start looking at that profitability, not just maximum yield. And it brings up the old adage, bucks in the bank versus bushels in the bin. And which focus is correct, or perhaps look at where prices are, where markets are, may lean your focus one way or the other. So a little bit what we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk a little bit about some of the end work we've wrapped up over the last couple of years on corn in Michigan, some of the FOSS work we've done on corn in Michigan. If we have time, I'll talk a little bit about some of the cover crop work that we finished up, and a little bit on kind of an extraneous issue, but becoming more and more popular by the week, some of the soil microbiome work that we've wrapped up, looking at actually DNA profiling in fields of the soil and see who's there and who's not there and what effect management may have on some of that soil microbiome. So, in full disclosure, we talk about Michigan corn soils. We're in the northern corn belt, so it's a little bit different than Ohio. All right, so some of what you see today may not directly apply, but you might be able to take a couple take-home points. Our soil textures are anywhere from beach sand or sugar sand, as I like to say, to clay loam. Mostly non-irrigated, other than our coarse textured soils. Low organic matter, I'm talking 2.5%, probably towards the upper end for a lot of our corn production soils in the state. Down to anywhere from a half to just under 1%. Our soil pH is anywhere from 6 to 8.3. All right, so all over the board. Our CECs on a lot of our corn production soils, anywhere from 1 to about 20. All right, so quite variable. And yes, I worked on a field 3 years ago that we actually had a CEC of 1.1. Never thought I would see that. Never thought I would work on ground like that. Very, very coarse textured sand. We tend to be high in carbonates. So when you start talking about our calcium content, most of our corn production soils is about 2,500 to 3,000 ppm or higher. Our corn ground is mainly tile drained. Okay, somewhat aggressively. I saw a tile going in on the way down this morning. Most growers are probably in that, spacing about 25-foot strings for new tile, or they'll split the 66s in half and have 33s, especially when we get up into the thumb, which tends to be some of our higher production soils up in that neck of the woods. We also tend to have very minimal spring residual N. You're talking probably anywhere from about 15 to 25 or 28 pounds is what we end up with come spring planting time. So one of the new challenges that we've dealt with is climate variability. This isn't necessarily about climate change. All right, so I'm not going to talk about climate change today. I'm just going to talk about variable climates and variable springs that we've had the last 10, 11, 12 years. All right, and I bring this up because we might be able to use Michigan as a bit of a template for other states to what to expect moving forward over the next 10, 20, 30 years. We've seen all the models out there, right? So one of the things that we tend to deal with is that we get these fronts coming across from the Badger State, all right, and then they encounter the big pond to the west of Michigan, and what happens? They fizzle. All right, so we get these fronts, these northerns coming through, as I like to refer to them as, coming through, and it was like this last July, we saw one that dropped, I think, 8 inches of rain just north of Milwaukee in Fond du Lac, Wisconsin. Thought finally we're going to get some precipitation middle of summer. What happens? Comes across the lake, 8 inches on one side of the lake, comes across the lake, we ended up with about 1/10. All right, so that's something that because we're buffered by 3 Great Lakes, okay, we're a little bit of a different climate. And this happens whether coming from the west or whether coming from the east. We've seen both. So it's something that we encounter a little bit more often than some of the other states, for instance, the I states. So if you look back the last, what I got on here, 12, 13 years, I look back at April, May, and June, and I don't really consider anything excessively wet or excessively dry unless you deviate by about 33%, more or less. Okay, that's just the number that I came up with myself. So when you look at the last 10, 12 years of the April, May, and Junes, any number listed in red be about a greater than 33% reduction from our 30-year norm, so dry. Any number listed in green would be greater than a 33% increase, or wet. And then any number listed in black would be within those parameters and normal. And you can look at April, May, and June, and it turns out we have about a 49 or 50% chance of being normal, about a 25% chance of being wet, and a 25% chance of being dry. Okay, I couldn't have made up the data even better myself if I picked the numbers from a hat. So, what does that tell us? We have equal chances of being wet and dry. And it's interesting to note, some of these dry periods have really impacted us. And I'll throw some more data up there in a little bit. But you look at some of the June periods that we've had, some of the April periods that we had, April's the month that really sinks or floats our wheat crop. June in Michigan is the month that really sinks or makes the corn crop. I just was talking at some national beet meetings last week, and you start talking about pre-plant versus sidedress. With our beet acres, these 3 years, 13, 14, and 15, our sidedress out-yielded pre-plants head and shoulders. But the last 3 years, 16, 17, 18, pre-plants out-yielded our sidedress and sugar beets, okay, by head and shoulders. And why? Climate variability. So it has to do with how wet are you going to be looking at that crystal ball. Okay, and your management is going to be dictated by how wet or dry that is and how clear that crystal ball is. And you can watch the 5 o'clock news tonight and that weather report. How accurate is it? Yeah, no one really wants to comment on that. And if they're wrong, who cares, right? We don't remember 1 day ago. So it's something that we really have taken a look at in Michigan and kind of have looked at our management accordingly. So when you look at core nitrogen strategies, in my opinion, you have to answer 2 questions. Can we deliver N to the plant timely? And notice it says to the plant, not to the ground. So often we spread it and forget it and hope that it gets into the plant in a timely fashion. But that previous slide is really going to impact how quick that N gets into the plant. The other thing is, can we reduce those opportunities for N loss? All right, and that's where some of that sidedress application timing can come into play. And maybe something like starter fertilizer, which we'll talk a little bit more about. And again, with our corn crop, June is usually that month that in Michigan that really makes or breaks that crop. So a lot of this gets into 4-hour nutrient management. Right? We've all heard it time and time again what the 4 R's are, right? But they're all regionally specific, okay? If not state specific within a state and regions within a state. All right, so you have to have local implementation, and all those components, rate, time, place, source, they all intertwine. We get so focused, we put those blinders on, I'm only going to focus on rate and screw everything else, right? No, they all intertwine, they all interconnect. So you have to address all four. And so I knew where I was speaking today, so I had to throw this photo up there, even though I know he's not the active coach, right? But what is your strategy? All right, and maybe more important, can you adjust? All right, we talk about the cookbook mentality of soil fertility, right? And I teach the upper level fertility class at MSU in the fall. Now everyone wants to come in, tell me how to grow corn, tell me how to grow beans. I'll write it down on a card, and there you go. Right? Well, no, it's not that simple, right? And we get this mentality that you write it down and forget about it. That's just what you do. But can you adjust? And why do you need to adjust? Because of those numbers right there. Okay, what you do in 2018 may not work in 2019. Okay, it might be a complete 180. All right, so can you adjust your strategy? Or what is your strategy? You know, I always like to throw this picture up there because it reminds me of my dad growing up. You know, and a lot of us in this room, your dad tells you how to do something, and your dad tells you how to do something once, right? And you better remember how to do it. So this reminds me, you know, I'm changing oil on the tractor or something, and man, I forgot what's next. This goes back when I'm 12, 13 years old. And I can see my dad on the other side of the yard. I screwed something up, and he's just pointing at his head, like, use your head. What is your strategy? Think. No one wants to think. So you talk about fertility and nutrient management, we have to think. So you talk about what is your strategy? Are you prepared for kickoff? And that's it. What happens after kickoff? Well, I don't know. I'm going to go out all pre-plant and be done. Okay, have you scripted the first 15 plays? Well, what if the first 8 plays don't work? You're going to keep doing the next 7? Probably not. You have to be able to adjust. So what's your plan in between? Your pre-plant, your ad-plant, and if you choose to use a Sidedress. What if you get 8 inches of rain in June? What if you get 0 inches of rain in June? What if you get no rain June and July? Is there something we can do? Is there something we shouldn't do? So it's something we have to consider. We talk about efficiency, we talk about efficacy. We've talked a lot about this the last couple of years. Farm size is not getting smaller anytime soon. All right? And so as we get more efficient from a business perspective, are we getting less efficient with our nutrient applications? It's something to consider. As farm size increases, what do? We tend to apply nutrients sooner, earlier, and a much larger scale. So from a business perspective, it's quicker. Might be easier to do, but from an efficient or efficacy perspective, are we becoming less effective with our nutrient applications? And some of this is going to be soil specific. Okay, look at that soil map and soil type. Consider starting right to finish well. Okay, it's an old adage, trying to bring that back. You've got to get that plant off to a good start. Why? You want to set that plant up to capitalize on those June and July growing conditions. All right, that's something at planting time, that's our last opportunity to really have good control over what that plant may or may not do. Because we don't know that next month afterwards if it's going to be extremely wet or extremely dry. So we're going to talk a little bit about N rate, not much. We know we want to be 100% certain of N sufficiency. We know that's not the most profitable. We know low N rates can decrease profitability from lost yield. We know higher N rates may not result in additional yield, and we get some environmental risks at play then. And then we get that most profitable N rate, which a lot of the land grants talk about, that can help protect some of those risks. But I always like to throw this picture up there. I took this probably 3-4 years ago now. You know, we talk about high N, low N, no N, etc. Look at the cob on the left and look at the cob on the right. You start talking about high N rates and low N rates. You know, do you think how big of a difference do you think there is between the cob on the left and the cob on the right with regards to the total N rate? I think it's 20 pounds, 40 pounds, 50, 100, 150. We don't know. On the left was 80 units of N. On the right was 140 units of N. Okay, so only 60 unit difference. So you start talking about, you know, what higher nitrogen rates can do. I'm saying higher at 140. Okay, I'm not talking higher 280 to 300. You know, that's the impact that grain fill has. Okay, look at the size of that individual kernel. right? And we don't need that at some of these higher end rates. So it doesn't mean we don't see response at higher end rates, but it's something to think about. All right, I'm going to talk a little bit more about some of those end rates. So you start talking about what is the correct end rate for 200 bushel corn. All right, and Emerson down here in Illinois is going to be one rate. Ohio's going to be another rate. Indiana's going to be another. Michigan's going to be another. Wisconsin, etc. But you start looking at, is it 240 pounds, 2 to 240, 160 to 200, 120 to 160? I don't know. I don't care. Multiple guess, multiple choice. You know, all of the above. So basically looking at A is about 1.2 pounds per bushel. B is about 1, 0.8, 0.6, etc. You know, what is that correct end rate? I always like to ask this, especially at winter extension meetings. And most people are probably in that, you know, a few A's, but that B or C category. All right? So let's look at some of our end response this last year. And I always put it out in tabular form or table form. All right? Here we're looking at not a highly buffered soil, but you got a CEC about 8.5, about 2% organic matter, 0 to 300 pounds. You know, you can look at how the numbers flow here. Check plot at 97, up to 140 at 50, then it peaks at 177. But you know that 177 number tends to stand out. But I always tell people and I always tell students, don't just look at things in number form. Okay? Put it into graphical form. And why? Because this is what you begin to catch. Okay? Same data. And what you're looking at here, you see that rise up to about 100 units. You see that dip. And then you see the rise at 250 and out to 300. This is what we typically see as an end response curve in Michigan. All right? You see a rise, dip, and then you see that secondary rise. So why do I throw this up there? Right? If you want to start looking at profitability with nitrogen, you got to catch the first hump in the curve. Okay, so often we try to do on-farm trials, and everyone wants to forget those low end rates because we know they don't work. All right, but if you forget those low end rates, guess what? You miss the first hump in the curve. Then you come to the first hump being at 200 units, which you think may be the most profitable because 150 was a lower number, when in essence, you got statistically similar yields at about 100 units less. So remember, grain yield and biomass are two different things. Okay, beyond that optimum grain yield, we might support additional biomass production, additional green. I always say I like that corn to look Spartan green. All right? And that's where some of that N is going, but it doesn't necessarily translate into yield. And we know there is no year-to-year relationship between optimal corn N rate and grain yield. That's why we can't just hone in on that one specific N rate. Now, I always talk to growers that say, I'm dialed in. I don't need any assistance with N rate. I'm dialed in. Well, you might be dialed in 2018, but doesn't mean that rate's going to work in 2019 or that it worked in 2017. Another field. Okay, this is on one of our more buffered soils up in the thumb of Michigan. So instead of a CEC about 8, 8.5, we're looking at CEC of 19. And this one had about 3% organic matter. So one of the higher organic matter soils that we have in the state from a corn production standpoint. And what do we see going from 0 to 250 units again? All right, you see at 0, you're at about 110 bushel. About 50, we're up to about 160. At 100, we're just shy of 200. At 150, we break 200. Then we see that dip, and then we see that spike. All right, so again, you got to catch that first hump in the curve. Otherwise, we tend to over-apply N. And sometimes, when we go beyond this, it's that optimal environment that's going to make this a more economical N rate when you get beyond that first hump in the curve. And that doesn't happen every year. You got to have that timely moisture. That is what we've been missing the last couple of years. We probably had timely moisture late. Probably 2015 was the last year where we had about a ½ inch, 3/4 of an inch of rain every week. It was beautiful. 12, 14-foot corn, green as can be, didn't start to leaf fire till the 3rd or 4th week in August. Fantastic. That is not the norm. So again, you got to look at graphically catching that first hump in the curve. And this isn't just a corn thing. All right, so I took some wheat data yesterday, threw it out there. This is our soft white wheat response. What do we see? We see the same thing, the same trend. You go up from 0, you get that first hump, you get a dip, and then you go up from there. But some of those higher N rates may not always necessarily be more profitable. Yes, question in the back. So typically when we get to those higher end rates, we're supporting vegetative growth. So we might see bigger corn, but guess what? You're not paid for 12-foot corn versus 10-foot corn. All right, we're not talking silage perspective here. And we see the same thing in wheat, like you see here. I'll go to the next one. Potato. In phosphorus, we see the same thing. All right, this is rates of P2O5 at the bottom. We go up, we hit the top of the curve, hit that dip, and then we start to go up. So why I throw this all out there is you got to catch that first bump in the curve. Here's an on-farm phos trial we did with potato this last year. And the grower did not want to go down below 20 GPA of 1034O as starter. Right? So you're looking at here about 80 units of P2O5, and they would have sworn their standard is about 40 to 45 gallons to the acre. Well, guess what? Their standard is 40 to 45 gallons to the acre. You know why? Because they don't go at the lower end rates. All right? So if you go down to 10 and 0, you would catch that first bump in the curve. But if you ignore those lower rates, guess what happens? You miss that, and you always think it's got to be greater, and it never showed up. So that's one thing we tend to stress. It's not about exactly, telling you what end rate to use. Just make sure you're catching the right end of the curve. All right? And everyone, Illinois, Ohio, Indiana, Michigan, Wisconsin, we're all on the MRTN. So we all have this table out there. This is what ours look like for 2018. We'll update this in another week or so. But again, just make sure you're honed in on where you should be with regards to that end spectrum. And don't always just look at that high end of the curve, because you might be surprised at what you see a little bit lower on that curve. And that's not to say growers should apply less nitrogen. Every field's going to be different. All right? But take a look at what that spectrum looks like on some of those fields. And I always get the question, N is N, but you got to get it there, and where is there? You got to get it into the plant. So then we get to this time of year. How about sources? What should I use? If handled correctly, there's very little difference in many of our sources, but you got to apply them in the right place at the right time, etc. So anhydrous, in our state, is falling off a cliff. Our corn acres are probably less than 10% with anhydrous now. I would expect probably in the next 5 to 10 years that might be down to 0. All right, one of the more efficient N sources. Look at urea. Is it surface applied? Is it worked in? Should you use an inhibitor? Should you not use an inhibitor? Look at UAN. Surface applied, incorporated, foliar UAN. We get a lot more questions on that. Ammonium sulfate, PCU, etc. You got to have water to get that plant, or to get that end moving in the soil into the plant. That's one thing we tend to forget. Things like polymer-coated urea can work, but if you don't get rain, guess what? They're not going to work. If you don't have end-loss conditions, some of those products aren't going to work. So pay attention to where you apply some of those end sources. What we looked at the last couple of years was a lot more of this in-season N application, because that really caught on when you go back to about 2011, 12, 13. So your goal with in-season N is to better synchronize when you apply that N versus when that N is uptaken with the plant. And so there's a paper that came out from 2013 from Bender that looked at, between V and V2, you take up about 3% of your N. Between V2 and V6, 7%, and so on and so forth from there. And a lot of people honed in on that V10 to V14 window, where 29% of your N is uptaken. So all of a sudden, everyone in Michigan said, well, we should apply all of our N late vegetative. And maybe even we can ignore everything up to that point, because most of it is taken up at that point. All right, well, data don't always support that. So conventionally, we always look at about a V4 to V6 Sidedress window. All right, so then we started looking at these delayed V11, V12, knocking on the door of R1 applications. All right, and the challenge we get with those late vegetative applications is climate variability. And why? Look at June. This is what many of our fields look like this last end of May, Memorial Day weekend, and early June. All right, and this was in southwest Michigan. Go to the central and northeast part of the state, they were dry as a bone. But if you look at some of these precipitation totals for June, the last 13 years, we had 5 normal, 4 dry, and 4 wet. So what in the heck is a grower supposed to do? The status quo? You try something new? The earlier you apply, you get a better chance of some of those earlier end losses. The later you apply, you avoid some of these conditions that you see up here. And so if you look at 2018 specifically for our state, you know, this was a huge issue. This is rainfall between March 1 and November 1. I think you can see a lot of bars up there, right? But when you get, I really don't consider less than 1/4 of an inch a wetting front. Enough of a wetting front to push that end into the soil and into the ground. So when you take out a lot of those smaller sticks, you'll come to see that, you know, June and July, we had about 2 inches of rain total. All right, about 2.5 inches between 6.1 and 8.1, about a 40% reduction from our 30-year mean. So yes, it was dry. And so what we started a couple years ago is looking at some of these early season end applications comparing to some of these late vegetative applications. And when you look at early season NDVI, this is one thing we picked up on, is that the lower your NDVI reading early in the season at V6, the lower your corn yield. All right, so this idea picked up, well, if you go late vegetative sidedress, because we still get quite a bit of sidedress in Michigan, if you go late vegetative sidedress, you can just ignore that plant early in the season. Okay, I don't need to do anything with it. I'll tackle it at V10 to V14, somewhere in there. End of story. All right, this data would spell the fact that no, you can't do that. Okay, you have to look at how that end looks early in the season. So again, start right to finish well. So when you look at how corn in our state looks at that V11 sidedress time, and you can see over on the left we have in furrow, about 7 units of end in furrow with 133 units at V4 sidedress. On the right you see about 7 units in furrow with 133 units at V11 sidedress. And that V11 sidedress happened right after this picture. So this picture was taken at V11. What do we notice? You can see the yardstick. Okay, we see substantially smaller corn where we had 7 units early and waited for that late vegetative application. But the other thing that sticks out is what we see going on down here. We see leaf firing at the end of June. Not something we want to see in our state on June 28th. All right, so it's not enough to get that plant to the finish line or get that plant to that sidedress application timing, which is the ultimate goal. So you can look at a lot of numbers here. We looked at, we had 2 locations, 3 years. We looked at combinations of in furrow, about 7 units with V4, in furrow with V11, in furrow with V4 and V11. We looked at different series of PPIs blended with PCU. PL stands for poultry litter with a late vegetative sidedress. And at the bottom you can see your 2x2s with V4, V11, and V4 and V11 sidedress. So you can see when you look at those in furrows, V4 versus V11, we really don't see much of a benefit with in furrow with those late vegetative applications, which tells us 2 things. One, may not be a good idea to go lean early and save everything for late, but 2, it's not enough juice to get that plant to that sidedress application timing. Right? Not enough N to get that plant to that sidedress application timing. Look at your 2x2s. Same thing. 2x2 of V4, 2x2 of V11, and 2x2 of V4 and V11. We see mostly there's some statistical differences. Some are statistically similar. You can look at the letters. But we really don't see too much of an advantage to that late vegetative sidedress application timing. We saw one instance in 2015 where we saw yield increase, wasn't statistically significant, to that late sidedress application timing. Look at the difference between V4 and V11 down here and V4 and V11 up top. June of 2015, we got 8 inches of rain between our V4 sidedress and our V11 sidedress. Now you start thinking, man, you know, what happens after you apply in? It always rains, right? When you least want it to. Right? Talk to potato growers all the time. They put out 250 units of N. What happens? You get a 6-inch thunderstorm. Next year you do it and it doesn't rain at all. Right? So you think you apply in, it's gone. So we got 8 inches of rain in about 2 weeks. Okay, it was wet. We had ponded fields. But you start looking at the yield difference that shows up, it wasn't all that much. Okay, especially when you start looking at overall some of those 2x2 numbers versus some of the in furrow versus PPI numbers. So again, this goes back to one-pass versus multi-pass application systems. Should you do it all up front? blow and go, spread it and forget it, should you side dress. Okay, that side dress in our state comes into play during those shoulder seasons, especially those extremely wet seasons, or in some cases those extremely dry. Depends if you have an early, mid, or late season drought. But you can look at 14, 15, and 16. We'll continue this next year and have about 5 or 6 years together here. We saw about anywhere between a 9 and 31 bushel to acre increase due to a multi-pass application. But, there's always a but, right? That doesn't mean PPI applications are bad. PPI applications can be just as effective as Sidedress applications. It depends on those shoulder seasons. And we'll get, you can get into an argument about, well, do you know more 3 or 4 weeks into the growing season than you did at planting time? Yes, that may be true. But some of this also depends on your specific field and your specific soil type. And I always tell growers, look at a soil map. Everything's digitized and freely available online now. How many of you in here know your soil depth? I ask growers this all the time. I ask students who farm this all the time. And they're just staring at their shoes. I don't know. My favorite answer, I don't know. What's your soil depth? I don't know. Well, why not? It's all freely available. Look at it. Okay, soil depth can have a huge issue on whether you should go with a Sidedress application, or you might be able to get away with a pre-plant application. In Michigan, we do not have a 5-foot model saw for our corn production acres. All right? We don't have 5 feet of nice rich topsoil. Most cases, you're looking at maybe anywhere between 24 and 48 inches tops with your A and B horizon combined. All right, in very few cases, we'll get down to about 60 inches up towards the thumb. So look at that soil depth sometime. You're sitting at home tonight. I don't think the Buckeyes are playing, right? You got nothing to do, have a cold one, go online, the digital web soil survey, and look at that soil depth for your specific field. And look at some of the variability from this last year in your field, and does it relate to that soil depth? You might be surprised what you can learn from a soils map that you thought you could only learn from a drone, for instance. Right? That soil map can tell you so much about what that field looks like. And that may also dictate whether you go with an early pre-plant application or go with a split Sidedress application. So 2018, I'll throw these photos up there. The 2 cobs on the left are 145 units of N applied at V4, was 167 bushel. 2 cobs on the right were 145 units at V12, ended up at 153 bushel. All right? About a 14 bushel drop by delaying only towards that late Sidedress application. Right, so later is not necessarily always better just because you get more uptake at that point in time. Right, you got to get it in the ground and into the plant. You go to the next one, 2 cobs on the left, 145 units at V12, 2 cobs on the right, 40 units of N in a 2x2, followed by 105 units at V12. 153 bushel versus 176 bushel. Looking at about a 23 bushel difference. And why? Start right to finish well. That subsurface application in our state has worked quite effectively because of that climate variability issue and a little bit on the soil variability that we deal with. Okay, most fields may have 3 to 5 different soil types on a lot of our corn production acres. Right? So it's about getting that plant out of the ground and getting enough fuel to get to the finish line, harvest time, but also giving it enough fuel to get to that Sidedress application time, whenever that may be. 2 cobs on the left, 145 units at V4, 167 bushel. 2 cobs on the right, 40 units in a 2x2, 105 at V4, 194 bushel. Okay, again, you're looking at a 20, 25, 27 bushel difference. Same N rate. What's the difference? The 40 units in a 2x2 to get that to keep that plant cranking early in the season, because we don't know if the end of May and June are going to be wet or dry. All right, and you got to support that root growth to get that top growth. All right, so that's where a lot of that benefit in our neck of the woods to that 2x2 with that Sidedress work cohesively have really come into play. So what about our state specifically? Normal to dry April to June rainfall. We have not seen any yield increases with a delayed Sidedress with a late vegetative sidedress, or R1, close to R1, compared to a V4 to V6 application. Now, the chunk of our acres is probably on about 98 to 104 day corn. Okay, so we don't get much into the 106, 108 and up from there. So we have a much shorter compressed growing season. Some of the wet seasons that we've seen, that delayed sidedress has reduced opportunity for losses, but did not produce significant yield gains compared to a V4 to V6 sidedress. All right, multi-pass systems, split-end systems, we've seen yield increases anywhere from 4.5 to 16 compared to one-pass strategies, but it's going to be completely year-specific. I know a lot of growers who go pre-plant and do fantastic. But some of that goes back to some of those growers have maybe a 3, 4, 5 foot soil depth versus others that have much shallower soils. Delayed sidedress can still be considered as a rescue application in our neck of the woods. So if we get into one of these stretches, May and June are just wet, and you can't get out there, don't throw in the towel. Yes, that delayed sidedress, you can still get 200 plus bushel corn. All right, but it may not be the best management practice, the best recommendation overall from our perspective. We have not seen some of those benefits. Other things we've noticed is we got to satisfy those early corn end requirements. Okay, this idea that you can get away with an in furrow and save everything for late, we have not seen that pay off yet. Okay, you got to keep that plant cranking early in the season. We know all of the yield expression factors that are influenced early in the season. So you got to have that sufficient N until sidedress, because that'll impact the success of your in-season sidedress application timing. We know subsurface banded ag plant continues to offer more consistent grain yield response. When I look back at about 8 years of data. Those 2x2s have been the most consistent that we've had, compared to pre-plants, compared to weed and feed method, compared to early versus mid versus late sidedress, all of those combinations, that 2x2 has offered consistency. And we tend to call that the start right capacity. To offer that start right capacity to that plant to capitalize on those mid and late season growing conditions. We do know that 40 units in a 2x2 is not sufficient to delay your sidedress to V11 or close to R1. All right, and this is on about a 98 to 104 day corn. Okay, we probably need to be more in that 55 to 60 wheelhouse in a 2x2 than we are at 40. So it's not about late vegetative is bad and conventional is good. Okay, whatever sidedress application timing you choose, you gotta get that plant enough juice to get to that sidedress application timing. And that's one thing you really have to hone in on. So we know that greater 2x2 rate is required for those late vegetative, close to R1 applications, as compared to some of those V4 to V6 application timings. We've also done quite a bit of work the last couple of years looking at coulter inject sidedress versus something like the wide drop surface applications. So you can see basically we've looked at applying your end midway between 30-inch corn, okay, midway between the row versus surface applied adjacent to the plant. Summarize this a couple weeks back. We haven't seen much of a benefit in our neck of the woods. You can look on the left, looking at yield perspective. That's across 4 site years, 2017, 2018. Our coulter inject has done just as well as the wide drop. A little bit of a difference in profitability. But again, we just haven't seen much of a benefit. But you look at 2017 and 2018 have been pretty dry midsummers. And that's probably one of the reasons why you see the 2 bars on the left look the way that they do. So, sum up a little bit, what we've seen is, remember, we're on a little bit of a shortened growing season. So we're a little bit different than Ohio. Okay, and why? We have shorter hybrids as far as maturity length. So we have a reduced duration of N uptake. We just have a shorter growing season. All right, so that may help explain some of the success of those delayed sidedress applications in longer growing season climates. We have, in our state, we have fewer suboptimal growing degree days, have a much larger impact on plant growth and development. So it takes a cold, wet, 3-day stretch in June, hits us much more than it does the states as you move south, because we have everything compressed into a shorter growing season. So all these factors probably come together to explain some of the results that we threw up here today. So again, one thing I always try to emphasize is that start rate capacity. You got to get that plant enough gas, all right, to capitalize on those mid-season environmental conditions, whether it's going to be wet or whether it's going to be too dry. So how does this play into yield versus profitability? And the bucks in the bank versus bushels in the bin. Well, I came up with this a couple weeks back. You know, you look at the table on the left. Look at if your standard management's 183 bushels, and you add an input, and you get 185 bushels. You look at that like, I'm losing. I could have gotten more. I lost, right? You look on the right, you look at from a different approach. If your standard management was 185 and you added an input and you saw reduced, you're not really mad. This gets into the sociology and the psychology of agriculture. People dislike small losses much more than they like small gains. You know, there's really no difference between those two tables up there, 185 versus 183, right? But if you're losing something, you're taking something away, I could have done more. Right? But at $2.80 corn, $3 corn, we got to start thinking about the profitability and where we are at. So you start, you know, this idea that people don't like losses or dislike losses more than they love gains. So we're driven to avoid those losses much more than we are to achieve gains. And this carries over into some of our choices with regards to management, where we try to focus on not losing yield. I don't want to lose yield, so I'm going to add X, Y, and Z in 1, 2, and 3, rather than start looking at profitability and seeing how profitable some of those inputs may be. And you think, you know, that's hogwash. Well, are you risk tolerant or risk adverse? Which is it? And I know some of you in here probably golf. So picture this. You got a 14-foot putt. Right? And according to the USGA, on a 14-foot putt, I believe you have a 50-50 chance of sinking that putt. Beyond that, it starts to go 51% not sinking, 52% not sinking, etc. as you go further out. Now, some of this may depend on, you know, you're putting for a birdie. How accurate are you? Now, some of this may depend on, is this the first hole or the 18th hole? If you've had one cold one or maybe 6, 7, or 8 cold ones, right? But people tend to be a little more accurate putting for par to avoid a loss than you are putting for a birdie for a small gain. I think that rings true in agriculture about trying to avoid a loss or disliking small gains. If you're putting for a birdie, you're like, what the heck, give it a whap. But all of a sudden, if you even have a 2-foot putt for par, and you're playing match play or group play, whatever, you got a 2-foot putt for par, pressure's on. Right? Because if you don't sink that, guess what? You're going to lose a stroke. So again, use that mentality a little bit to carry over to agriculture as you make your options and choices for the 2019 growing season. So a few slides I want to pick up here yet. We've done a lot of work on Phos and P2O5. I know Steve Coleman at Ohio State has done quite a bit of this work also, so we kind of piggyback on with some of that work to try to answer the question, should we or should we not be applying more phosphorus? We're all under the gun. You know, we're surrounded by water. However, that Western Lake Erie Basin is a multi-state issue. So I always throw this out there. What is the correct P2O5 rate for 200 bushel corn? And I'll ask students this, and I'll get a lot of different answers. Whether it's A, B, C, or D. Right? Anybody know what the correct answer is? You know. Depends on your soil test. Got to look at that soil test. So what we started a couple years back was take the phosphorus challenge. Okay, I grew up in the 80s. I took the Pepsi challenge. I preferred Coke. Thought it was a great analogy. Take the Phos challenge. Should you or should you not apply phosphorus? All right, so we looked at all on-farm trials. We had about 28 on-farm trials with and without P. I always emphasize to the grower, remember soil testing for Phos indicates the likelihood of response. Remember that soil test indicates P that is available to plants, not how much total P is in the soil. It's one thing we tend to forget. And I started this because I was seeing Phos applications being based purely on crop removal. I want 150 bushel wheat, multiply it by crop removal of X, that's my application. I want 250 bushel corn, multiply it by 0.36 or 0.38 pounds of P2O5 per bushel, that's my FOS application. All right, without a soil test in our state, it's very difficult to make a valid recommendation because we have a document called the nutrient GAMPS, GAAMPS, which stands for Generally Accepted Agricultural Management Practices. And that document is directly tied to an individual grower's right to farm. So if you follow this set of guidelines, you are protected in a lawsuit if there tends to be a water quality issue. And it says in there, FOS recommendations are based specifically on a soil test. So if you're not looking at soil testing, you could technically be in violation of those nutrient GAMPs. And if we have a water quality issue, kaboom. Right? That's why you got to look at that soil test. And you got to use the correct method. We tend to have a little more folks on higher pH soils. So make sure, I always tend to stress, if you're on some of these 7.5, 7.6 and higher pH soils, to perhaps look at the Olsen method as opposed to the Bray or the Malick. So I summarized some of these sites from the last 3 years, and you can see this is where our grain yield response, the FOS fertilizer 2016 to 2018, these were our P-responsive sites. We actually got some fields that were down to 6 parts per million. You know how hard it is to find a field at 6 ppm, Bray P1? It is not an easy task. All right, so we got some fields down there. You can see some of these sites had a decent response, but even that field on the far left that was at 6 parts per million, with FOS is red bar, without FOS is blue bar. We only saw about a 23 bushel bump in that field way on the left. So even in these low scenarios when we apply FOS, we're not seeing these 40, 50, 60, 70 bushel increases by applying FOS. You look at our non-responsive sites, again, tend to be a little on the higher side of our SDP levels. And again, these are all Bray P1. You can see some 76, 70, 62s. Even had one in there at 16, or I guess 2 in there at 16, that were non-responsive. All right, so we tend to think of nutrient management as black and white. And we talk about critical levels as black and white. But you got to remember, it's a law of averages. And I always tend to stress this. When you look at that soil test, if something comes back at 15 parts per million, you probably have areas in that field that are 16, 17, 18, 19, 20. And you probably have areas in that field that might be at 14, 13, 12, 11, and 10. And did you go to the right depth? No, that could be another issue. So when we mapped all these yield responses out, this is based on purely yield. You can see SDP soil test level 0 to 8 inch at the bottom, yield on the left. Fit a linear plateau curve, found that joint point. What did that critical level turn out to be? 16 parts per million. So we always get the comment that everything's outdated. We have new practices, we have new hybrids, we have new this, we have new that. But soils can be very slow to change. In some cases, soils don't change. So what we found over the last 3 years that the critical level that's currently listed in both our recs for Michigan and the tri-state recs for our state tends to be spot on at that 16 part per million point. Now when you look at relative yield, same thing. So relative yield kind of accounts for variability year to year. So you look at the yield without P and divide that by your yield with P, and you can see when we fit that curve, critical limit tended to come out at 16 parts per million also. So not all that different from what was currently suggested. If you cut that soil sample to 2 inches, some people have suggested that, go down to a 0 to 2 inch depth. We really didn't find anything more accurate. That critical level tended to be 18 parts per million. So again, right in that ballpark of where that 15 used to be. So this goes back to, we're also looking in our state at revising the FOS recommendations. Probably looks like we're not going to budge all that much. All right, that 15 for corn, 15 for soybean, 25 for wheat, and 25 for beet are probably going to stay. We just have not seen many differences from there. One thing that we are looking at is potentially eliminating this drawdown range for FOS and maybe even potassium, because we're just not drawing down like we're supposed to. When we have soil test FOS levels 2.5 to 4 times the agronomic level, all right, we're just not drawing down as intended. So that's something that could be on the forefront that we are also looking at in addition to Ohio and Indiana. Couple slides going to wrap up here. We always look at some cover crop practices and whatnot. When I first came on board, 8 years ago now, there were people saying, well, you plant something like a radish cover crop, you may never have to apply a single drop of nitrogen to your corn ever again, because it just scavenges everything out of that field and feeds it right back to that corn crop. I sat here scratching my head, where's the math on this? It's not a leguminous cover crop. Where is the end coming from? Okay, is it anecdotal, which often tends to be? So we took a look at a couple different cover crop choices. Look at oats. We looked at radish. Even in Michigan, following a wheat crop, our maximum amount of cover crop growth is about 79 to 83 days. That's about all we can get. And that's with having our ducks in a row, harvesting wheat, getting everything in, not getting a rain, and getting that cover crop in the last week in July or first week in August. Okay, that's about the max amount of growth that we can get. And so you can see even with some of the radishes that we can get some fairly substantial radish growth. You can see on the left there, you can see what some of these look like in the field. Much of that biomass might be below ground. But it was surprising, one thing we found, and we just had this paper come out in SSAJ a couple weeks back. Look at corn grain response. Look at radish, oat, and no cover crop. Okay, and we looked at 6 different N application methods with each of those. And we also looked at a no N at each of those, because you've got to look at that check plot with each cover crop to gauge the N response. And what we found out was, when you look at those blue bars up there, having a radish or oat cover crop increased our response to nitrogen. Which tells us what? They were probably immobilizing some of that N out of the field. All right, which makes sense. We know that with oats. Okay, we see it with rye. All right, but with that radish, kind of is in a gray category, because it's not a leguminous cover crop. All right, yet it's not a green manure. All right, it's a scavenger, so it scavenges it, and does the N just sit there for the following cash crop? Probably not. So what we actually ended up seeing is where we had a radish and oat cover crop, some of our corn yields were reduced by 12 to 14%. Okay, that radish was probably taking about 20, 25 units of N out of the system. And it wasn't giving it back the following season to that corn grain crop. Right, so that's something we picked up on over the last couple of years. One other thing that we've started to look at is the soil microbiome. All right, and this is a huge black box. All right, and I always like to throw this up there because, if you look at the estimated number of operational taxonomic units, that's what OTU stands for. Basically, number of bugs, number of microbes. All right, if you look at the human gut, we got about 2,000 or less in the human body. Look at unmanaged native soil, something like a prairie soil, 16, 17,000. Start looking at what we saw in year 1 and year 2 of this study, anywhere between 50 and 92,000. Okay, this is a huge black box. There's lots of little guys and gals, lots of little bugs in that ground. Very diverse systems that we work at. And I always throw that up there to show how complex of a system soils actually are. It always amazes me. You look at that human gut versus what we find. My gosh, the human body is a miracle. You start looking at what we're walking on is also a miracle. So what we wanted to look at over the last couple of years was, does management impact, in some essence, soil health? So we'll look at some of those DNA issues out there. And so I'm going to sum this up in about 2 or 3 slides. It could probably take 20 or 30 slides. I'm going to try to break it down. You look at in-row, stands for rhizosphere. Okay, so between plants. BR stands for between row, basically bulk soil. Okay, halfway between corn rows. And one thing we noticed is that rhizosphere diversity of the soil microbiome was always less than bulk soil. All right. The other thing we noticed, you can see some of our N management methods over on the left. You see 0N, urea PPI, poultry litter with the V11 Sidedress, and some different 2x2 combinations. It was always interesting to note, when you start looking at it from a statistical standpoint, where we had 2x2 N applied, that 199 and down was always statistically less, so less diversity than where we did not apply a big slug of soluble N fertilizer close to the plant. So So that told us a couple of things. One, that rhizosphere, in essence, in many cases, is less diverse than our bulk soil. But two, that plant may be selectively choosing who is present in that soil system. All right? Because it's one thing, what drove me batty about some of the soil health work out there, you see all this work out there, no one reports a yield. Right? How are growers still paid? Profitability, yield, right? So you got to look at that yield component. So when we started looking at that, we picked up on this. And this is some of the same data in graphical nature, looking at the impact of N management practice. But you can see anywhere we had that 2x2N application, we tend to see less soil microbial diversity, which you would tend to think is a bad thing. The other thing we picked up on is where we use that organic amendment like poultry litter, we tended to not see that drop in microbial diversity. So what we actually found was that poultry litter, that organic amendment, tended to reduce the impact of soil bacterial communities. And why? It's a slow-release fertilizer. So when you throw a slug of soluble N out in that system, okay, you get growth. What happens when you get growth? Roots exude certain compounds. Certain microbes are going to flock to those compounds and proliferate and use it as a food source. So that plant can choose who is present and who is not present. And so when we look at that overall diversity, this is what we found. As corn grain yield increased, our microbial diversity decreased. Or you could say, as microbial diversity went down, our corn grain yield went down. All right, and we've seen this in corn, we've seen it in wheat, we've seen it in potato, we've seen it in soybean, and a couple colleagues have even seen it in more obscure crops like truffles. All right, so again, when you start talking about soil health, it's also about what that plant does for the soil, and some of those compounds that plant can exude. Some preliminary implications we found from some of this work. We're going to sum some more of this up over the next 12 months or so. We saw that N management affected diversity, microbiome diversity more frequently than cover crops. We saw an inverse relationship or an opposite relationship between yield and diversity. Relative to 0N, that banded 2x2N reduced our diversity 8 to 34%, and some of that might be due to Coulter inject. We tend to think of soil disturbance as tillage, but Coulter inject might be enough of a soil disturbance to impact who is and who is not there. And we also noticed that poultry litter reduced changes to that bacterial community or provided a bit of stability. So this is something that we're really honing in on across all 5 or 6 cropping systems that we work on. So you'll see a little bit more data coming forth in the near future. So with that, I'll wrap up. Appreciate your time today. I'll be around for a while. Otherwise, I'll stick around and take any questions. So thank you very much.